Single camera productions are productions that, as the name clearly states, only use a single camera. All of the footage is filmed on one singular camera, every angle, every shot, every pan. This means that every time that you would need a different angle of the same shot, you would need to physically move the camera in order to achieve it. The majority of the time with single camera productions, shots are filmed out of sequence and put into the sequence at the end by the editor. You'd have definitely watched a few single camera productions before. The Office, My Name is Earl, and Malcolm in the Middle are a few examples that I'm sure you've heard of. SCPs are always filmed with one camera. Another difference is they often use real-world locations and sets, unlike sitcoms. Building a scene is one of the most important ways of creating a realistic environment for your characters to act in. It involves gathering backgrounds and props which have a link to the narrative. For example, cooking shows are often about food, and this means that they're usually set in kitchen environments. The 180-degree rule is really important when creating conversations in a single camera production. When you edit it, you need to make sure that none of the cameras break the 180-degree line. If the camera isn't within the 180-degree boundary, it can make the conversation look a bit unrealistic and a tad tacky for the editing. Here's a skit made to explain how lighting affects a single camera production. When indoors, there is less natural lighting, so more artificial lighting should really be used there. Single camera productions often require artificial lighting. Due to only one camera being used, it's easy to move the lighting around anyway, so it's not really much of a problem. Building a scene can often also affect the mood of the viewer. For example, if you've got a darker scene, it can bring feelings of sadness to you, but if it's lighter, it's generally more of a happier environment. A good example for this would be the REM music video for Shiny Happy People. It has lots of bright colours and happy scenes, and it makes the entire thing look a bit happier than it would. Building a story is surprisingly similar to building a scene. It is the act of creating a good narrative which is easy for the viewer to follow. When you build a story, you generally have to have a good idea of where to start and where to finish. Generally, the story is a huge element of any media production that gets finished. Make sure that you have thought over any ideas and also palmed a few away. Make sure that you've got the perfect narrative for your single camera production. This is why, in single camera productions, it is important to come up with a range of good ideas in order to make sure that you choose the best one for your narrative. Knowing your story is also really important because it enables the viewer to develop certain emotions for certain characters in your narrative. They learn who the characters are and how to empathise with them in anything that they do, and it generally helps the viewer follow the story as a whole. A good example is the UK comedy The Office. In this show, it is stylised so it seems like quite a random show, but if you watch all of them, there is a string of narratives involving all the characters which eventually come to a closing point at the end of it. This enables viewers that have watched the entire series to follow the narratives and follow the characters' storylines up to the end. This shows how, even in a tongue-in-cheek show, building a story is really important. The age group of the audience is also a really important thing when building a story. For example, if you're building a narrative for younger children, you're not going to include any themes that are taboo or can't really be seen by children. The time of the story and setting is also important to think about when thinking about the age of the audience. For example, if a story was set in the 1950s, then it has to be portrayed as suitable for the time of era. Some of the things that must be considered when thinking about this are setting, language, age and clothing, and other range of elements. When you compare building a story to building a scene, you can find that they're actually both quite important to each other. For example, if you have a brilliant story but not very good scenes, it can let the entire project down, and vice versa. Building a scene and building a story are both as important as each other when compared. Linear narratives are narratives that follow the story from start to finish. They contain no flashbacks or no time alterations at all. It is literally the story from start to finish. It runs in chronological order. Some stories are more effective at using a linear narrative than a non-linear narrative due to the way the story is written and what the sequence of events are. Stories that have a linear narrative often rise in tension and come to a climax at the end of the narrative. Non-linear narratives tend to have epic moments throughout in seemingly random points in order to come to a conclusion. This could be due to the amount of flashbacks or any other time alterations that they've made. The Office, especially the US version, is an example of a show that follows a linear narrative. An example would be if you watched an episode in season 1 and then an episode in season 4, the characters and relationships would have changed so drastically that it would be quite hard for the viewer to follow. Peep Show is another show that follows a linear narrative, however it's not so dependent on the narrative. For example, you could turn on an episode in season 1 and then change to one in season 5, and you'd be able to follow it pretty well because it doesn't rely on the narrative as much. As I said before, a non-linear narrative is a narrative that doesn't necessarily follow the structure of time. This means that any non-linear narrative could include flashbacks, time jumps, some even include the end of the story before they tell the start. This is a good way of getting the new audiences to join because they can join at any point, and also it helps the story progress if it's an especially complicated narrative. A good example of this is the movie £7, and in this film, a lot of flashbacks occur. The audience can't see what's happening during the flashbacks. This type of narrative is also good for making it effective and reveal some key findings along the way. Some examples of films which have used non-linear narratives are Slumdog Millionaire, Reservoir Dogs, and 500 Days of Summer. When comparing non-linear and linear narratives, generally linear comes out on top. This is because linear narratives are easy, the audience can follow it well, which makes it more successful. Non-linear narratives can often become confusing due to the amount of flashbacks and time manipulations that it becomes a bit less interesting for the audience to watch, and it loses a bit on the production as a whole. Another two types of building a narrative are open and closed endings. Firstly, there is an open ending or an open narrative. This one leaves the production on a cliffhanger at the end in order to leave it a bit open. A good example of this would be the Fast and Furious films, as most of them are ended on an open narrative, which means that sequels can be developed from pretty much all of them. In order to create an open narrative, there are a lot of content in the film that needs to be closed off, however they must leave a few main storylines open. This is so that when creating a sequel, they can take those storylines and develop them into a completely new film. A good example of open narratives are any soap opera. These soap operas run on for undetermined amounts of time, and they always leave them on open endings. A good example would be Coronation Street or EastEnders. In comparison to an open narrative, there is a closed narrative. A closed narrative is one that leaves the ending of the storyline so there is absolutely no way you can develop a sequel from it. This means that all the main storylines in the narrative are closed off completely and left finalised by the end of the production. A closed narrative is commonly used in smaller productions because they might not have the funding to make a sequel, or they might just want to leave the story at its close at the first hurdle. A good example of these would be any Disney films such as Tarzan, Cinderella, and other great films like Top Gun and Good Morning Vietnam. Closed narratives have the advantage of not withholding any information from the audience, as so to leave the production on a good final ending. This, in turn, makes the audience feel satisfied and entertained by the narrative of the film. When comparing and contrasting open and closed narratives, generally open narratives come out on top. This is because when a sequel is made, the audience feel more satisfied with the story continuing, and they are more interested in the production. Closed narratives often leave it on a really big end, and the audience are dissatisfied because they can't see any more productions based on that storyline. It also allows the sequel narrative to follow and to keep the audience interested, as the case with soap operas like I said before. Genres are very important in single camera productions as well. When creating a single camera production, the genre is really important, as some genres fit the single camera production technique better than others. For example, if you were to make an action film, you're more than likely going to need more than one camera. This is because of all the action shots and different locations. You're going to need more than one camera in order to get the different angles that you want in one. A good example of a single camera production in a genre is a comedy genre, and a good example would be The Thick of It. This show mixed comedy, political drama, and a single camera production, and because of this it worked brilliantly. This is a great example of using the perfect genre for a single camera production. Another good example which I have is the Brooklyn Nine-Nine TV show. This is a detective drama, thriller, and also single camera production. A single drama is a television show that has been created to only be broadcasted once. These shows are usually for educational purposes and are mostly based off a true event or a hot topic. The reason why the show is only broadcasted once is because the producer feels that the event is more appropriate for television than film. An example of this would be the drama Dirty War, which was a documentary about the terrorist attacks on London. This drama was only broadcast once because it was a very touchy event, and they felt that the production only needed to be made once and broadcasted on television. If the single drama had been created for a true event, for example Stolen, which was a show about child trafficking, these videos would usually have detailed explanations with someone being interviewed of the event that happened as well. They would have even been involved in it or been a bystander, or at least have extensive knowledge of the subject. Also, the single drama would usually be a true event, and it would involve a reenactment of the event or the experiences that the person had with it. Generally, single dramas are single camera productions. This is because, due to the extensive amount of interviewing in the show, there is only really one camera that needs to be used for the entirety of the filming. Also, single dramas involve a lot of flashbacks and footage from the actual event, so some footage doesn't even need to be filmed by the crew at all. A good example would be the Channel 4 documentary 9/11 The Lost Tapes. This single drama involved a lot of interviewing, however, lots of it involved viewing of footage from the actual event of 9/11, which meant that less filming was required. There are many different types of shot sizes and camera angles that you can do when filming a single camera production. These can add a different narrative to the story, or it can just make the footage a bit more effective and interesting for the viewer to watch. Now the shot types are wide shot, mid shot, close up, cutaway, and over the shoulder. Camera angles are bird's eye view, high, eye level, or low canted. Now, shot sizes and camera angles can always be mixed to create a different view for the viewer to experience when watching the single camera production. Now, combining different shot sizes and different camera angles means it's more of an interesting view for the audience to experience. They're more hooked on it because the camera angles are more interesting and not boring, and they're more likely to stick with the program to the very end. With other shot types, such as the over-the-shoulder shot types, you can actually experience what the view from a specific character is like, which means the audience are more drawn into it and they're more likely to stick out with the program again. Continuity editing. Continuity editing is when you take the footage you filmed and put it into a sequence to make sure that it follows the linear narrative. It is also described as the arrangements of shots put into a series of events. An example of this in terms of a single camera production is when you're making a cooking show and you're putting different shots into the sequence, but obviously the shots are taking place at the same time. This could mean you can have a shot of the chef, a shot of the food, and a shot of the table in which the food's going to be put on. This is all happening at the same time, but the footage is put in the sequence, so it seems like they're happening one after another. Another example of continuity editing is when you're filming different scenes at different times, all the characters must be wearing the same clothes in order to make it look like that they're still in the timeline. Cross-cutting. Cross-cutting links into post-production. It's what you do after you've arranged your footage into the sequence of events. When it's all laid out in front of you, you can move it in the editing to make sure things happen before certain other events. This is a good way that single camera productions create flashbacks, because they move the footage down the timeline and they can make sure certain events happen before they actually do. This is how cross-cutting creates an interesting narrative for the audience to follow. Montages are also an effective thing to use when creating a single camera production. Montages are very short sequences of clips happening one after another, usually to a backing track. Montages get across a lot of information in a short amount of time and can actually be used as emphasis for time passing. Montages can also be used in narration, for example in the film The Rules of Attraction, which narrates a journey to different European cities. Now obviously it would take a lot of time to get to the different cities, however it's created as a montage so that things happen one after another in a quick sequence. A flashback is an effect that is used in a lot of single camera productions. Now what this is it shows an event that happened prior to where you are at the moment in the narrative. This is so the audience can find out certain things about characters, or it can just show you an event that had previously happened in order to gain more information. The use of flashbacks can help engage the audience and to help them understand what is happening whilst looking into a person's thoughts or memories. Realist is also a different type of narrative. Realism is where, in a program, it is filmed to make it seem like it's actually happening and are real people with real stories. A good example would be The Office. The Office is filmed through a window to the characters' lives, and it's almost like watching real people doing their real thing. It is also made out to be a very realist program. Anti-realist is the opposite of realist. It is where a program is either too stupid or simply cannot be regarded as real. A good example would be The Mighty Boosh because of what happens in the show. For example, could be the way the characters act or the way in which they're presented to the show. When comparing both realist and anti-realist, realist often comes out on top. This is because they are more suitable for the audience to watch and it's easy to follow. Anti-realist shows can often be quite silly and stupid and people might be turned off by that idea. Scripting is a very important part of single camera production and it's the backbone of the entire production itself. Making sure that you have written a really good script for your program, make sure that people are going to be interested and engaged into it. When you write a script, you're going to need sure that it's easy to follow and interesting for the audience to watch. If you have a long and boring script, audiences are more likely to be turned away by the program, whereas having a good script that tightens the storyline and keeps it all intact makes sure that the single camera production is easy to follow and will be more successful to the audience. Scripting is usually done by professional scriptwriters in a high quality single camera production, and this can also be shown as a screenplay. A script would normally include dialogue and action of what is going to happen as well as just the lines that the characters are going to say.